manner. Easily answers the question given to him with irrefutable clarity and grace. He tells the young expert in the biblical law who asked him the question, yes, lawyers used to know God's word, not just law. So he says, this is the greatest commandment. He says, love God with all your heart, right? We'll get to that in a minute. And love your neighbor as yourself. Now, as I've said several times recently and during this message, and I will continue to say this throughout my ministry as long as I'm pastoring, there is absolutely no way you can tell me that you love people and you're not serving anyone. That's impossible. If all you do is worry about your own life, if you don't serve other people, you do not love them. If you are married and you're not serving your spouse, if you are not giving away to your spouse, if you think marriage is all about getting something, then you are not loving. If you have children and you are not giving yourself away to your children, okay? And I mean a lot of giving with children. You don't love them. You've got to give some things up to love your children, don't you? Especially when it's soccer season. Baseball, Cub Scouts. Cub Scouts. Holy mackerel. I didn't know it was a cult, you know. Man. That was a joke, by the way. They expect a lot from you in Cub Scouts, so. But you got to give yourself away, man. If you want to love people, you got to give yourself away. If you are in a church family, you're not serving people in your church in some way. You don't love those people. It's not possible. If you're in a community and you don't love, if you're not giving yourself away, if you're in a work setting and you don't sacrifice in some way for other people, listen, the bottom line is you simply can't love. You can't love the poor and the sick and the homeless and not serve them. And let me tell you something else. You can't love the rich and the privileged and the people that live in mansions unless you serve them either. Right? It's simply not possible. Now here's how John put it in 1 John 3:18. He said this. He said, my children, our love should not just be words and talk. It must be true love, which shows itself in what? Action. Because action truly does speak louder than words. It's been said that what you're saying is coming across so loud I can't hear what you're speaking. Right? People know if you really love them or not after a while. Yes, you can fool people for a short time, can't you? But if people want to find out if you truly love them, all they have to do over time is watch your life. We have to demonstrate love to others. There's no other way to actually love somebody. Love is a verb. Yes, it begins on the inside, but it has to manifest itself with actions on the outside. Now, before we move along any further here, we get into how do we tune into this love thing? How do we tune in to the receiver, if you will, of service so we can clearly love out loud? Before we do that, I want to go back to the Old Testament for a minute. And I want to look at the verse that Jesus quoted when he said, love your neighbor as yourself, because it's couched in a very interesting passage in the Old Testament. Let's look here at Leviticus 19 and verse 18. Here's what Jesus quoted. He quoted part of this verse, and it says this. It says, never get revenge. My kids need to learn that with each other. Never get revenge. We need to learn it too, though, don't we? Never hold a grudge against any of your people. Instead, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And then he says, I am the Lord. And that's very relevant because we're going to tie that into what we're going to talk about in just a minute. You see, when I did a little cross-reference search and I found this verse, it really blew me away. I never had gone back to the Old Testament in all my years of studying God's Word and looked at this verse. Can you believe that? What kind of pastor do you have? But I went back and I looked at this verse, And I thought to myself, I don't have any excuses for not loving people. Even if they've done wrong to me, I'm supposed to love them. I'm not supposed to seek revenge. I'm not supposed to hold a grudge against people who've done wrong to me, but I'm supposed to love them. And by the way, there was another time when this smart aleck guy came up to Jesus, and Jesus said, well, you know the commandments, blah, 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 love your neighbor as yourself. And he said, well, who's my neighbor? Right? Because he would have known this verse, and it says, your people, right? Speaking of the Israelites. And Jesus told this little story, a little parable about the Good Samaritan. You might have heard of it before. And he goes through, he says, the priest walked by, this guy gets beat up, the priest walked by, and some other religious people walk by, and a Samaritan comes by, a dog! And he helps this Jew, right? And Jesus says, who was his true neighbor? Who truly loved him? And the guy said, of course, the Samaritan guy. And Jesus' point was, your neighbor's anybody who needs help, who's around you. So listen, we don't have any excuses for not loving people. Now, Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. And here's the thing, Jesus preceded this thought, this magnanimous concept, with something even grander and inextricably linked to the concept of serving. What precedes this verse will allow us to tune in the receiver, if you will, so we can love out loud. This is how we turn up the volume of love so it rings loud and clear. And I want to summarize it with this thought, and I want you to write this down. To love people, I must first love God. To love people, I've got to love God. This is where true love originates. If we want to love them, we've got to get a sharp, crisp dose of God's love, His signal, if you will. And this is why Jesus said this before He talked about loving our neighbors. He said this. Jesus answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. He said, this is the first and most important commandment. Jesus said, above everything else you can do in this life, He said, you've got to love God first. He said, this is the preeminent commandment. This is the one that everything else is founded on. If we want to love people and serve them and give our lives away, if we want to have the kind of passion and selfless love, not just for the lovable, not just for those who love us back, but for the unlovable, for those who are our enemies even, we have to have a relationship with God. As a matter of fact, one cannot love God and not serve people. Once you get into a love relationship with God, once you understand His love for us, His mercy, His grace, you'll start to love other people. Service begins with a permeating, all-encompassing love for God, with heart, soul, and mind, Jesus said. The two thoughts here, loving God and loving people, by the way, are seamlessly interconnected in Jesus' mind. When you love God, you serve people. And when you serve people with the right motives, you're loving God at the same time. Those two are linked. That's why Jesus said the greatest commandment is really two, but they're linked together. So love God and love people. Now, George Barna is a researcher, and he's a prolific author. He's written many, many books. I highly recommend him as an author. He wrote a book called Revolution about 3 years ago, and I used that book as a foundation for a series of messages called How to Have a Revolution. You might remember that if you were here back then. But in this groundbreaking work, he talked about people that he called revolutionaries. Now, since he's written the book over the past 3 years, he's continued to track the habits of these people that he calls revolutionaries. Now, there's some very interesting things about these folks. I want to read to you from an article that was written off of his website. Let me first define a revolutionary as he defines it, or share his definition, I should say, of a revolutionary. A revolutionary is defined as born-again people, Christ followers, who have made their faith in God the highest priority in their life, who believe that their faith has greatly transformed their life, and who often express and experience their faith through alternate